Wednesday evening, many of us gathered in this sanctuary for a post-election vigil, and I used the following subtitle in the congregation-wide email that I sent to indicate the spirit in which the vigil was intended. Healing our hearts and healing the heart of our democracy. We have too many blocked hearts and broken hearts in this country. There is too much meanness, incivility, and lack of compassion. As I said Wednesday, in the wake of any election that I can remember, and I've been doing this minister thing for a while now, regardless of which party won, I would not feel compelled to schedule a vigil the next day. But this election season has been particularly divisive. As I preached before from this pulpit, it is certainly possible to be a religious liberal and a political conservative. When we say that Unitarian Universalism is a liberal religious movement, it's a reference much older than contemporary liberalism. It reaches back to that Latin word libere, meaning freedom. Unitarian Universalism is a free religious movement, which includes the freedom to choose politically conservative positions. And we have many examples from our history of Unitarians who were political conservatives, most famous, President William Howard Taft, who was a Republican president of the United States and later president of the Unitarian General Conference. But irrespective of the partisan divide, it's important to call out that in this election season, Donald Trump has been a bully. He has regularly proclaimed misinformation with confidence, and he has fanned the flames of racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, and Islamophobia. And while all that is true, I am not saying that the whole story of the Trump campaign, nor that that's the whole story. I'm not saying that's the whole story of the Trump campaign, nor am I saying that all Trump supporters are racist, anti-Semitic, misogynistic Islamophobes. There are, for example, clearly individuals and segments of this country that voted for our first black president, named Barack Hussein Obama. They voted for his Change I Can Believe In campaign. They voted for it in 2004. They voted for it again in 2008. And some of those same individuals in regions of this country also voted for Donald Trump's promise of change. But even though Trump represents change and hope to some American voters, the centrality of bigotry to his campaign means that oppressed groups in this country feel particularly vulnerable after this election, much more so than any election in recent memory. So although I knew holding a post-election vigil entailed the possibility of being misunderstood, I felt it was worth the risk to offer a safe place for people feeling vulnerable, alienated, and alone to process their feelings in community. I felt it was also important as a reassurance that this congregation is and continues to be a beloved community who answers the call of love. Regardless of this or any other election, we will continue to be in solidarity with Muslims, with women, with refugees, with people of color, and with people with disabilities. We will continue to advocate for the equal rights of lesbians, gays, bisexual, and transgender citizens of this country. Now, there are many different reasons that people join Unitarian Universalist congregations, but one of the most consistent themes I've heard as I've listened to many different ones of you who've told me why you joined this congregation, that one of the most consistent themes is I heard that, well, I read the UU7 principles and I thought, wow, that's what I actually think. I didn't know it was possible for a religious community like that to exist. And it remains the case in the wake of this or any other election that we as a congregation continue to covenant and affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. For some of you, Hillary Clinton was your dream candidate. For others of you, she was a compromise. For still others of you, or for friends and family members, voted for a third party, voted for Donald Trump, or didn't vote at all, for a variety of complicated reasons. There is not time this morning for me to attempt a nuanced analysis of the election, nor is there any reason for me to try to attempt and replicate what increasing numbers of people are already doing in the New York Times and the Washington Post and many other forums. I will say that I'm skeptical of simplistic explanations. As many of you have heard me say before, I am a proponent of intersectionality. An intersectional analysis uses the analogy of a traffic intersection in which multiple people are coming from many different directions and meeting at that center all at the same time. And any full accounting of this election must account for, at minimum, race, gender, class, sexual orientation, religion, and age, and how they all played out differently in different individuals and groups and regions for complex historical and cultural reasons. Regarding the divides in our country, I'll limit myself for now to one story from a white, Midwestern, heterosexual male who is a former evangelical Christian who has become a religious atheist, a political leftist, and a college professor. In wrestling with the political divides within his own family, especially as the holiday season approaches, he writes this: "My parents are good people. They are honest, they work hard, they are generous. My dad makes friends everywhere he goes. My mom went to college late in life to become a teacher specifically so she could help underprivileged black students. They both voted for Trump, in their perception as a lesser evil. What's disturbing to me," he writes, "is my mom's inability to even hear why I would find Trump to be especially problematic. It was as though it was just another election. If I decided to cut them off," now he's just speaking for himself, he may make a different decision, but he writes, "If I decided to cut them off or even skip Christmas this year, while the wound was fresh, it would not be for my parents a teachable moment. Any more than the time that this really happened to him, any more than the time that my dad's favorite talk show host, Rush Limbaugh, casually slandered me to a national audience, causing such a vitriolic hate campaign against me that I got off Twitter. My dad offered to call into Rush's show, assuming that he could explain that my comment was all just a joke, and that Rush, of all people, would be sympathetic for someone getting in trouble for an ill-considered joke. Anyway, harassment campaigns happen on the left, too, we should be honest. No, if I chose to break contact over this, I fear it would be evidence that to my family, I am now totally lost. Even that most extreme gesture would not be enough to cut through the armor of misinformation, innuendo, and false equivalency that they have built up. We are a divided nation in many ways, but we continue to need one another more than ever, and we must continue to answer the call to love, but also in ways that are boundaried and keep us safe as well. That's a discernment that we all have to make individually, but that we can help each other make as well. More broadly, Brexit, the United Kingdom's vote in June to withdraw from the European Union, the election of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States last week, and the potential election next year in France, the far-right leader, Marine Le Pen. These are all reactionary movements against globalization. But with the rise of climate change, the internet, and how economically entangled the world already is, it is far from clear that a nativist retreat from internationalism is even possible. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said 50 years ago when he addressed the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1966, he said, "We have inherited a large house, a great world house, in which we are forced to live together. A family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn somehow to live together in peace. Together we must learn to live as a family, or together we will perish as fools." As UUs, we are particularly poised to help model a big tent way of building multicultural, beloved communities. We are far from perfect, but we have a lot of experience building bridges amidst diversity. The goal of building beloved community connects with my sermon title of No Permanent Waves. As many of you know, I sit down each June to plan my sermon topics for the next year. So in early summer, when I reflected on what might be helpful to preach about on the Sunday after the election, my gut inclination was to preach about the history of the women's movement, because it felt appropriate regardless of the election's outcome. Here's where you get to decide if that was wise or not. Given the prominent role of many of our UU forebears and that they played in the women's suffrage and the women's liberation movement, if Hillary won, it would be an opportunity to reflect on the significance of the first female president of the United States and all of the people who sacrificed to make that possibility a reality. If this election turned out not to be the election of the first female president, it nevertheless felt appropriate to remember times that the women's movement faced setbacks before rising again to fight the good fight. There are no permanent waves, but when a wave crashes, another begins the process of rising up. To give a brief sketch of the cresting and crashing waves that have brought us to this present moment, the first wave of the women's movement in the U.S. began to rise 170 years ago in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, with the first Women's Rights Convention. The first wave crested 96 years ago in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. There's a wonderful story, there's so many wonderful stories, but I'll share just one. That when Tennessee became the 36th and final state to ratify the 19th Amendment, the final and deciding vote in Tennessee belonged to the 24-year-old Harry Burns. He changed his vote after receiving a last-minute telegram from his mother reminding him, "Be a good boy and vote for suffrage." As an example of how long waves can take it's an example of how close votes can be and how they can go either way. It's also as an example of how long waves can take to crest. Only one of the original signers of that 1848 declaration lived to see women win the right to vote in this country in 1920. But the groundwork in 1848 was vital to the victory that came 7 decades later. After 4 decades of rebuilding, the second wave of the women's movement began in the early 1960s, along with many of the countercultural movements of the 1960s. And that wave grew in size and strength to achieve many successes, including the passage of Title IX in 1972, which prohibited sex discrimination in schools receiving federal funding and created a sea change in athletic opportunities for girls and women. The 1973 Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade advanced reproductive justice for women. But despite these and other successes, second-wave feminism began tragically crashing with the slow death of the Equal Rights Amendment, which simply said that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Although the ERA passed the House of Representatives and the Senate to triumphant celebration in 1971 and 1972, respectively, it was ultimately defeated a decade later in 1982 when North Carolina tabled the amendment and Florida and Illinois rejected it. After a backlash to the women's movement in the 1980s, many historians date a resurgent third wave of the women's movement to the rise in consciousness around sexual harassment, triggered by law professor Anita Hill's allegations against Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas in 1991. The sexist way that the all-male Senate Judiciary Committee treated Professor Hill inspired many women to run for Congress the next year. That's always an option after you're defeated, is to run for office. And that resulted in 5 new female senators and 24 new women in the House of Representatives. The second and third waves of the women's movement have also been increasingly intersectional, accounting not only for gender, but also for race and class and sexual orientation and transgender women. We're too close historically to accurately discern, has the third wave ended? Is a fourth wave beginning? But the more important point for this morning is there are no permanent waves in this or any other justice movement. And the wave metaphor also doesn't mean that those decades that are excluded from the wave, but before 1848 or from 1920 to 1960, those weren't feminist-free zones. They were just times of rebuilding. When a wave crashes, another begins the process of rising up again. Any surfer will tell you that as glorious as it is to ride a wave, you can't constantly spend your time up at the top of a wave. That's just not how the ocean works. But in the words of one of my colleagues, our job is to keep scanning the horizons because the next wave will come. As I've been reflecting on this wave metaphor, the poem that keeps coming to mind is by Marge Piercy, The Low Road. It's from her 1980 collection, The Moon is Always Female. She writes, What can they do to you? To you alone, they can do whatever they want. They can set you up. They can bust you. They can break your fingers. They can burn your brain with electricity. They can blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child. They can wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Well, alone you can fight. You can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they will roll over you. But two people fighting, back to back, can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon, an army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can win a whole house, you can eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and you can host a fundraising party. A dozen makes a demonstration, 100 fills a hall. 1,000 has solidarity in your own newsletter. 10,000 power in your own paper, 100,000 your own media, 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know what you mean, and each day you mean one more. We are in this together. I'm grateful to be with you on this journey. For now, I'll conclude with these words from my colleague, the Reverend Ashley Horan. Each of you is enough. You are precious, and your work and your life matter. You are already part of a we, a great cloud of witnesses, living and dead, who have insisted that this beautiful and broken world of ours is a blessing worthy of deep gratitude and fierce protection. Whatever happens in the wake of this or any other presidential election, our ancestors, our descendants, they are beckoning us, they are compelling us to go onward toward greater connection, greater compassion, greater commitment to one another and to this earth. Together, we are resilient and resourceful enough to say yes to that call, to make it our life's work in 1,000 different ways, knowing that we can do no other than to bind ourselves more tightly together and to throw ourselves into the holy work of continuing to show up again and again to be part of building that world that we dream about but have not yet seen. We haven't yet seen it. In that spirit, let's rise and embody your spirit. Let's sing together hymn 131. Love will guide us.